let's see if that works. Greetings. Oh, it's showing me. I see the box over here. Let me get that out of the way. Hey, everybody. I'm not going to leave that on because it does use up a fair amount of bandwidth, and I don't want to make it more difficult on your end for anyone who wants to be able to see it. I have the fastest business line I could afford on my end, so we should be able to transmit without too much trouble, but we are on a distributed system that's operating literally all over the world, and therefore we can get bandwidth issues and lag occasionally. Let me turn off that video. Well, all right, I'll leave it on for a minute. One person happens to like that, so that's good. So let me do that. Now, when you see me looking over to the left, by the way, it's because my the question box is on in my second monitor. It's over to my left on there, but I'll try to look at the camera occasionally if that's helpful to you. Okay, so while I'm looking at this Google Doc, let me point out a few things. First of all, there's my contact information. You have my homepage, my blog, my email address, my Twitter handle, and even my newsletter, which again, totally unrelated to this course. But if I'm going to bring up my newsletter, I also made sure to add in a link here to the Gradle newsletter, which is actually very good. It comes out roughly every month, and it's full of good links and other information and updates about what's going on with Gradle and new plugins and things from the community and stuff like that. I do recommend it. The nice thing is we can take a look at that link, which we will shortly, and see that if you want to look at the newsletter before you subscribe, you can take a look. I think they have the 6 most recent issues are always available online, and you can take a look at that. Another thing I want to put in here, the email address for the training issues in general is training@gradle.com. So if you have a problem with the course or you're unable to get in or tomorrow or whatever happens, that's the email address to contact. That's fine. You can always email me, but all I would do is probably forward it to that same email address, you know. So just letting you know. A couple other overhead related things. Let's see. Let me check here just some of the questions very quickly. Yeah, there's some questions about installation and what version of Gradle and all that, and we are going to get through all that. We're going to start, I'm going to make the assumption that you don't actually have any background in Gradle at all. So if you do have some background in Gradle, you're ahead of the game in that. And therefore, today is going to feel, at least the beginning of today, is going to feel a little bit slow to some people, especially if you have some experience with Gradle. But I promise you we will pick up speed, and tomorrow we'll have a lot of information. And my experience with this course is that there's a handful of things that I've mentioned that many people who even worked with Gradle a long time are not familiar with, and I find very helpful. So I'm hoping there will be things both for beginners and for, let's just say, more experienced people, whatever your experience level happens to be on that. Again, so I'll leave the camera going for a moment. Now, one question that is inevitable is actually down here. Oh, and by the way, if you're trying to get at this URL, again, if it's hard to read, let me tell it to you out loud. Those letters after the tinyurl.com that's a Y, C8DR3CM. And that should allow you to access this document. I mean, I could check it myself if I click on it, and yeah, I go right in. So that's a good sign. Okay, and again, if you send me an email, which I've gotten at least one, I will send a copy of this document as a response when we take a break, or even better, tomorrow. Okay, now let's go over some of the frequently asked questions so that we're good on this. So the question that is inevitable that everybody wants to know is, are we being recorded? And yes, we are. So this session and tomorrow's session are both being recorded, but it takes time to process the recording. So you will not have today's recording before tomorrow. In fact, what happens is after tomorrow, everything will be processed, and you will get an email roughly 24 to 48 hours after the class is over, which will have a link to the streaming video. But you will have everything that we say and share on the screen and everything. You, unfortunately, I don't think it includes the questions though, and that's kind of unfortunate, but it's just a a symptom of the fact that we're using this platform, the GoToWebinar rather than GoToMeeting. See, if we use GoToMeeting, then you would be able to type in the chat box and there'd be a lot of interactive mechanisms, but we would have to limit the class size to a very relatively small number. And in order to have as many people as possible, we're using this GoToWebinar platform. So the best way to communicate with me is through the questions widget, although as I say, I will paste links in addition to in the shared doc. I'll also put them in the little chat box as well. Now, again, because you can't see any questions asked by anybody else, that's the other downside, is that you can only see the questions that you ask. Now, I can do an answer all, and it'll share the answer with everybody, but it still will mask out the name of the questioner. But normally I'll just answer privately. And because of that, I'll try not to be too distracted by the questions that come in. Instead, what I'll do is I will try to take like the last 5 to 10 minutes before a break and address questions out loud that might be of general applicability. And during the break, I will be filling in answers to as many questions as I can possibly keep up with. Now that brings up the question of breaks, for the schedule. So since this is a 4-hour class, my plan is to take a break basically each hour. So since we started in my time zone, 11:30, there'll be a break at 12:30, 1:30, and 2:30. Adjust for whatever time zone you happen to be in. And the break will be 10 minutes. And you saw I have that online timer just from Google. So I'll just set a 10-minute timer when the break occurs, and I'll share out my screen so you'll see it. So you'll know exactly how much time you have left before I'm going to plan to go on. So that's the rough plan. We can adjust that if it turns out to be necessary. Another common question that came in that I want to address is someone asked about the schedule for tomorrow is exactly the same time as today. The materials for tomorrow will be the same as today's materials. Just basically, I have a position in mind, a place in the materials where I intend to reach today, and then divide it roughly there, and then we will go on with that tomorrow. So it's all continued. This is basically a full one-day class split in half, roughly. Something like that. And another typical question that comes up is there is no certificate or completion certificate or anything like that. I know people have asked about it, and I'll pass that along to the people at Gradle. But at the moment, there's nothing available. There's no certification. There's no completion or anything like that. It's basically just a free class that's offered approximately every other month, and you're welcome to take it as many times as you like. So I think that's the benefit of it being free. If you sign up for the class, you'll get the email about the recording, even if you are unable to attend some or all of it. Of course, if you're not able to attend any of it, you don't know I just said that, but you'll see it on the recording. So that's fine. Okay, I just glancing at the questions to see there's nothing else I need to address right now. Okay, a couple other frequently asked questions, issues. So first of all, I've got the link again so that you can access it. The nice thing about this shared doc is it will remain available indefinitely. And not only that, I use this same doc every time I teach the class, and I've been teaching it for a couple of years now. So in other words, you're going to see there's tons of stuff already in it that may not seem relevant to what we're doing. I figured you might as well see the code or the responses to questions that came up in earlier classes. It's just not terribly well organized. I've got the stuff at the beginning, but then after that, it's just kind of whatever came up, I just pasted things in as we were dealing with it. So again, this is not some formal mechanism or whatever. It's just an easy way for us to share information. Okay, and again, yep, send me a link. Okay, now the link for the training materials was already pinned in the chat box, and here is that link again. I will copy it and paste it in the chat box again, even though it's already there, but what the heck, doesn't hurt anything. This will result in the download of a zip file, and we're going to go over the contents of that zip file in a moment. That's actually where we're going to start. So that zip file has in it not only the slides we're going to use, but also all the exercises and all the solutions as well. So it's a self-contained zip file. And that is something that is available to you whenever you want it. Feel free to download it. In fact, if you don't feel like coding along, You can just look at the proposed answers in there, or you can do the labs at a later date whenever you want. My plan is to do the exercises interactively with you. I'm going to work my way through it with you while the exercises are going on. I know it'd be better if you had time to do them, but actually 8 contact hours is really short for the amount of stuff we want to cover. And I want to talk to you about a lot of things that aren't even in the materials, and therefore I'd like to work through the exercises with you if possible. And that way you can ask questions and say, well, what if we did it this way, or what if we did it that way, or what about this issue I'm having at work, or whatever, and I'll be happy to try to address those as much as possible within the time constraints. And again, if there's things come up that are interesting, I'll paste information into the shared doc as well. Okay. One thing I do want to point out right at the beginning, because this will come up later, but I'll mention it now. We're going to spend a fair amount of time on the Gradle docs, the really well done. When you see the Gradle docs, you see a lot of time has been spent to try to make those as useful as possible. And one of the things that's in there is a discussion of how to use Gradle with a proxy. So those of you who are behind a firewall and need to adjust the proxy settings for Gradle, I want to show you that information now, even before we start any of the exercises, just so you know where to go on that. So this is not strictly necessary for anybody unless you are definitely on a proxy and you need Gradle to work through it. But we're going to go over this when we get to it in the materials. There is a file in every Gradle project that you can add called gradle.properties. And that file can be added to the root of your own Gradle project, or you could add it to your, what they call the Gradle user home. The Gradle user home is your user home directory, whatever your home directory is on your operating system, in a subfolder called .gradle. It's hard to see. Let me magnify that. There's a little dot in front of the Gradle here. So in a folder in your home directory called .gradle, if you add a gradle.properties file to that directory, then those properties will be applied to every Gradle build on your machine, basically, or never using that account. And the Gradle user home defaults to ~/.gradle, if you will, tilde being your home directory. And there's many things you could add to Gradle.properties, but one thing that you can add is proxy settings. And here are the proxy settings. So these 5 up here are for HTTP, and these are for HTTPS. And you could just copy and paste those right out of this file and just adjust the host, your proxy host and port and user ID and password. So I'm assuming you know those. Now that all comes out of this link here, which is in fact, let me go to that link. This is part of the user manual. You can see it accessing the web through an HTTP proxy. So another way you could find this information is simply to go to the docs, and I'll show you that, and there's a little search box, and just type proxy in there, and you'll see there it is. Accessing the web through an HTTP proxy, it brings us right to that section. So if you turn out to have a proxy issue, I want to give you that information up front, and then we will discuss, you know, the actual issues regarding Gradle.properties and all of those other features. Okay, let's see, those are all the frequently asked questions. So let me take a look here quickly at the question list and see if there's anything that I need to access. Now there's a question about, there's always questions about plans for other Gradle related training classes, things regarding Android or advanced classes or things like that. And the only things that are available right now is off of the Gradle homepage, gradle.org. If you go to the training section, that's where our current class is, as well as other hands-on workshops that tend to be focused on the Gradle Enterprise tool. Maven Build Cache Deep Dive, Gradle Build Cache Deep Dive, etc. Those are the classes that tend to get offered. So we don't have anything specifically for Android, but if you have Android-related questions, let me know. I have a fair amount of experience with Android-related Gradle build files, and I'll try to address them. And there's not an advanced class offered at the moment. Circumstances may change in the future. Not sure. Other questions having to do with IDEs and with other, somebody noticed, by the way, they don't have a Gradle.properties file under the .gradle folder. That's right, you don't have to have one. In fact, if there's not one there, just create, okay? So it's a simple text file with key equals value, just like you see here. This is a key and then an equal sign, and this is the value. So you could just create it if you want. Now, again, it's only necessary if you want it, and we'll talk about that file in general in the materials. Now, speaking of the materials, let's take a look at those. So if you were to download the materials from that zip file and unzip them, what I have done is, let me magnify this, is the name of the zip file was Intro to Gradle 1 Day 2020-01-15. So implying that's the January 15th, 2020 version of the Intro Gradle 1 Day materials. Of course, it's 2 half days for in our case, but still, that's the idea. And this is that file expanded. And you can see that inside that file, there is a directory called labs and a directory called slides. And there's setup instructions and slides as PDF files. Now the setup instructions are, I'm not even going to open that file. Basically, the idea is that you simply need Java 8, and that's really it. You know, in fact, it would be good to download and install Gradle, and I'm going to show you where you can do that in a moment. But in many cases, in some cases, we'll use a Gradle wrapper, and that'll do a download for you, and we're going to go over that as well. So the setup instructions really come down to you need Java 8, and it would be nice if you have Gradle. Now, there's many ways to install Gradle. And, oh, before I leave that, the slides here come either as a PDF or under the slides folder, you'll see there's an index.html file. So if I, let's see, I'll open with my browser. Actually, I'll just double click on it, right? And of course, unfortunately, it came up on the wrong window. So let me drag it over here. And this is what the slides look like if you use the HTML version, as you can see, if I scroll through a little bit. I think I'm going to turn off my camera now for a moment. So again, I can always turn the webcam back on. Oops, sorry, I turned off the screen share by mistake. There, that's the webcam turned off. There, so the screen share should be back now. Sorry about that, that was a mistake there. So yes, you need Java 1.8 or Java 8 is the other way to say it. The only problem, oh, somebody said, let me just take a look here. The magnifying didn't seem to work. I'm a little surprised by that. I thought that did actually seem to come out okay. So let me know if that's not working. Yeah, somebody pointed out in the setup instructions are a little bit dated, in fact. And one of the comments in the setup instructions is it says you can go to Gradle Home Samples, Java Quick Start and execute a build there. And a couple things have changed since that came out. First of all, the Gradle download no longer has the samples folder in it. So actually, that's the only thing that's really important, is that the samples are no longer included the way they used to be. So don't worry about that. We'll talk about everything. That was just a validation. In order to, just a minute here, in order to validate that things are working, once you've installed Gradle, you're just going to say Gradle-V, which will show the version of Gradle that you're using. Now, let me talk about the installation now so that it'll work. And somebody said they couldn't find their .gradle folder. It may not exist. You may have to create it, okay? And again, it would be in, you'd make it in your home directory, whatever home is, like on Windows, I think it's under home username or what have you. Okay, so again, you have the slides in PDF form if you want those, or you have them under the slides folder. And then there's a labs folder with 8 exercises, and we're going to be talking about all those over the next couple days. So let me go back to the home page for Gradle, and we'll talk about the installation of Gradle, just so you can verify your installation's okay and you have everything you need. So first things first, I do have to make sure that you're aware of this. there are two different websites associated with Gradle. There's Gradle.org and there's Gradle.com. Gradle.org is the one we want. So again, let me delete this here just so you can see it. Oh yes, the nice little statement at the top talking about the support. And oops, let me close that for the moment, but I do encourage you to take a look at that as a statement about what's going on, especially in the United States right now. But I'm going to leave that to your information if you want to take a look at it. So the important thing is I want to see Gradle.org. Gradle.org is the site associated with the open source build tool, the Gradle project, which is what we're all about. Gradle.com is associated with the product, the commercial tool that Gradle provides called Gradle Enterprise. So if I was to click on Gradle Enterprise, you'll see that now I'm on Gradle.com, and this is got features and pricing and customers and all this stuff. And it's all very good and very fascinating, but that's not what we're talking about. What we're going to talk about today and tomorrow is the free open source tool. Okay, so I want to emphasize this is the page I wanted to go to. Now let's talk about setup information. And there's a link, or a button rather, actually it's a link, isn't it? Right on the front page called Install Gradle. And if I look at this, let me scroll down. It shows you that what we need is Java version 8 or above. So if you have the current long-term support version of Gradle, of Java rather, which is 11, that's fine. In fact, the latest version of Gradle even works with Java 14, the latest version of Java as well. I personally will be using Java 11 for most of the class, but I'll do at least one demo in Java 8 just to show you it doesn't matter, that there's nothing we're going to do in this class that requires anything beyond Java 8. But Java 8 is the minimum. You do have to have that. So in fact, if you ran the java-version command like I could do here, if I say java-version, you see that I'm currently on Java 11 at the moment, but I use what's called SDK man. I can switch between Java versions if necessary, and I can run everything on Java 8 if I want, or 14 for that matter. So again, the minimum Java is 8, but if you have 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, any of those, they will all work just fine. One person mentioned they're on Java 13 on a Mac. I do want to point out that the versions that are not long-term support versions of Java, the ones that are not specifically labeled LTS, long-term support, are only intended to be used for 6 months. So that 13, as far as Oracle is concerned, 13 no longer really exists. You know, they've already gone to 14 back in March, and they'll go to 15 in September. And that's the 6-month release schedule. So then 16 the following March, and then finally 17 the following September. And 17 will be another long-term support version. Long-term support means Oracle guarantees bug fixes and security patches and everything for a minimum of 3 years. Anything beyond that would come from vendors or the open source community or something like that. 8 is a long-term support version, although Oracle would consider that to be end of life. And 11 is the current long-term support version. Most companies are planning to upgrade. Well, let's say it this way. They were planning to upgrade to 11 this year. And then, of course, the global pandemic threw a monkey wrench in a lot of those plans. So Gradle's still fine with 8. So if that's what you have, that's fine. If you have 7 or 6, though, you really need to upgrade. Okay. So that's the only prerequisite they're mentioning, and they're saying it even works with the JDK or even just the JRE, but I'd recommend using the JDK. We're going to want to compile Java code if we can. Now, there are ways to install Gradle from a package manager, or you could do a manual install. The manual install is really simple, but for those who have it available, on any Unix-based system, which includes Macs, there's a tool called SDK man. Let me magnify that a little bit bigger. SDK man is at sdkman.io. And the nice thing about SDK man is it allows you to switch between versions. Now, I gotta admit, I don't generally switch between Gradle versions very often, but it also makes it easy to update. Gradle, which is nice. If you're a homebrew person on Mac, there's Brew. Now, they don't say anything about Windows. Windows has a package manager that I've used for years called Scoop, if you've heard of that one, SCOOP. And Scoop will install Gradle for you. And I think they are in the process of upgrading Windows installations with Win 10. I can't remember what the new installer is called, WinGet or something like that, or maybe it looks like Wing It. Depends on how you pronounce it. I don't know what the status of that is, but I assume that will not have any trouble installing Gradle. However, really, it's the automatic installs are doing something very, very simple, because if you look at the manual install here, all you do is download a zip file and you unzip it, and that's what they say here, unpack the distribution, and then you add the bin directory inside it to your path, and you're done. So there's nothing that modifies the registry or you don't have to you don't have to do anything that changes your operating system if you don't want to. But there is an interesting feature of, there's a difference between downloading the binary only distribution and the complete one. The binary only one downloads a version that just has the executable parts in it. The complete one comes with the local docs, although that's not really all that needed. Generally, the docs are fine online, assuming you have online access. And the source code, of course, resides in GitHub. So again, that's not really all that critical in general. So you can access it if you want, but it's, the binary only is generally fine. I will point out that your IDEs tend to like the complete distribution, because then they allow you to access the source code of Gradle inside the IDE, with a control click or what have you. And we'll take a look at that later. So I currently have several versions of Gradle on my machine, but again, it's simply a question of downloading a zip file, and you unzip it. Here they put it in a special folder, but that's completely up to you. And then, like on Windows here, they put it in a Gradle folder or what have you. But all you really need to do is modify your path environment variable to include Gradle in it. And here they show you how to do it on Linux or Mac with an export using a bash syntax. Or here, there's the mechanism for Windows using environment variables under system variables generally, if you can. And then the verification that everything is working is the Gradle-v command. So personally, I use SDK man, and that means I can list my Gradle distributions here. Make that a little bit wider. And you can see here that these are all the versions of Gradle that SDK man knows about. The stars here are the ones that I have installed locally. The greater than sign, that's the one I'm currently using. Oh, I guess I should upgrade. Let me show you what it looks like to upgrade, to go to 6.5.1. If I say SDK install Gradle, it'll always install the latest if I do that. Or I could say 6.5.1, but if I just hit the return key, it downloads and installs it, and then I can set it as a default. Now, again, I did that because I'm on a very fast internet connection. But all the downloads from 6 and above should be very fast. Previous to that, there were some time delays in downloading Gradle. This one has been very fast for me. If I look at my, I think my Gradle home variable, I think I have one? Yeah, so I'm underneath .sdk man, there's a folder called candidates, Gradle, current, that's what I'm pointing to. So if I say Gradle-v, that's in my path, and you can see I'm on Gradle 6.5.1. So again, you can use any of those installation mechanisms, including a manual install, and you'll be fine. Now, you'll notice when I ran -v, not only does it tell me the build time, and you see this is new as of, what's that, a week ago? Yeah, so it was right about a week ago. It includes a Kotlin version and a Groovy version. Now, this says nothing about your project. Your project doesn't have to use Groovy, Kotlin, Java, anything. could just be a project that involves copying files from one location to another or creating zips or things like that. We're going to talk about all those options. But Gradle includes a version of Kotlin and a version of Groovy inside it to power Gradle itself. See, we're going to talk about how Gradle is really defines a DSL, a domain-specific language for managing your build. And Java is a very poor language for defining DSLs. It doesn't have what they call a meta object protocol. It doesn't do meta programming. But both Groovy and Kotlin are good languages for that sort of thing. Gradle uses Kotlin or Groovy to define a domain-specific language for your build file. If you're using the Groovy version, then the file will be called build.gradle. We'll see that all through the course. And there's a specific syntax to that that we'll be using. If you use the Kotlin DSL, the name of the build file will be called build.gradle.kts. Now, I have to put in the caveat, the name of the build file is actually flexible. You can actually change that. You don't have to use the default, but we're going to stick with the default pretty much the whole time in here. But you can modify that. So the Kotlin and Groovy parts are included with Gradle, but the actual functionality of Gradle is all implemented in Java. In fact, Gradle is almost completely Java at this point. The only parts that are Groovy or Kotlin are the parts that power the domain-specific language sections, the parts that interpret the DSL, as we'll see. Now, we are going to spend our time on the Groovy DSL. There is a Kotlin DSL, and I can point you to some documentation about it, and we can talk about it. But it's a question as to how ready it is for prime time right now. I'll simply say this. The dominant usage of Kotlin in the marketplace is for Android. Android apps are Kotlin first these days. Google has made it clear that Kotlin is the definitive language for Android, and they will be using that. And yet, their own build files in Android are using the Groovy DSL by default. They support the Kotlin DSL, but they use Groovy one. And that's interesting, and we'll stick with the Groovy one. Besides, if you want to look at any examples online from other projects, I don't mean the samples that you can get from Gradle, I mean actual open source projects in the community that you can browse. There are tens of thousands of example files in the Groovy DSL. There's very few in the Kotlin. There's a handful, but very few. And we'll talk about the differences as we go along. So I will bring it up. I'll simply say that the difference, there's a question in the Q&A, in the question widget about, is there a difference in performance? For small projects, not really. For large projects, the Kotlin DSL doesn't seem to be as fast yet as the Groovy DSL. But there are a lot of things that go into performance, and that's, you know, the DSL layer is a very small part of that. So in general, we'll discuss performance later, but the performance of Gradle is fine and has much more to do with your own project than with which DSL layer you're using. The big selling point of the Kotlin DSL is it's supposed to have better IDE integration with tools like IntelliJ IDEA, because it's a statically typed language, and therefore IDEs are better able to know what's going on in it. I'd say that the IDE integration is mediocre on both. Okay, IntelliJ is actually pretty good at handling the Groovy DSL, but it's not great at handling either of them, frankly. So that is one of the problems with Gradle, personally, that I find, that we do have this issue of the IDE support is either awful up to mediocre. It's not great in either one, but at least you're not coding in XML. See, so there's a trade-off. There's a trade-off. Okay, now, oh, and before I leave it, notice there's a version of Ant bundled inside Gradle as well. It's a simple jar file that's the basic Ant commands. In fact, you can use most Ant commands inside Gradle. There's a way to integrate them together, and I'll show a very brief demo of that if you're interested. This is showing the Java version I'm running on and the operating system that I'm on, and that's everything that came out of that. So again, the setup information is here. You can take a look at it. It's all under the install link. Again, just for your information, I'll paste it in the group chat, the chat box there. but it's a link right off of the home page. We'll talk about the Gradle wrapper shortly. Okay, now let me go to the materials and let's talk about that. So this is a brief slide to remind you that when you unzip the zip file, there's a folder called slides, and I started with the index.html page inside the slides folder. That's what we're looking at now. But there's also a PDF version if you'd rather stick with the PDF. Okay, and then the labs are under a labs folder numbered 01 through 08. Not all of them have solutions because not all of them require you to code. Some of them are simply, here, type this at the command line, try that, look at the results here. Some of them do. They generally don't have an instructions file. Instead, what they will have is a Gradle build file with comments at the top. And we'll talk about that when we get there. Now that brings up the issue of an IDE also. And let me address that briefly. Gradle does not require any particular IDE. The Gradle build files themselves are just straight text. You could edit them in Notepad if you wanted to. It doesn't require anything special. That said, there's very good IDE support for both IntelliJ and for Eclipse-based tools. There's a Gradle plugin for Eclipse, and there's a Gradle built-in support in IntelliJ. Even in the free version of IntelliJ, even in the community edition, they have good, solid Gradle support. There's also a set of good Gradle plugins for VS Code, if you happen to like Visual Studio Code as a basic text editor. And of course, there's support in NetBeans, but I haven't used that in a long time. I only use that if I have a client who uses it. So there is support on these things, but it's all we're going to do with it is use them for syntax highlighting, and I tend to run most of my Gradle builds from the command line. Okay. Now, by the way, when you install Gradle and you run the command, it's a question of seeing which one is in your path. If I had run a brew install, then I think it's under, actually, where do they put that? I think it's under user local seller Gradle. Isn't there a Gradle? I must not have done the brew install. But at any rate, I might have, if I did do the homebrew install, I would have a different version of Gradle under that path. And of course, someone may have installed it for you on your machine as well. So you'll have to see which one is in your path in order to see which one you're getting in general. Now, a note about the version numbers. You see that I just installed the latest one. I'd say 90% of everything we're going to talk about works in Gradle versions as far back as 3. You know, I mean, really, really old versions of Gradle, relatively speaking, you know, versions 3.0 and above probably would do 90% of what we're doing. The one thing that has changed has been the build scan feature. They changed that in 6 to put it in a different location. And therefore, that part has to require 6 or above. But if you have an older version of Gradle, virtually everything we do will work there too. I do recommend using the latest because after all, it's free. It doesn't hurt anything. It doesn't change anything on your registry again. It's just a simple zip download and putting the bin directory in your path. And I will try to use the latest because after all, I mean, if I don't use the latest, who's going to, right? I mean, it's in a Gradle training class. But again, you don't have to have the latest for everything we're going to do. I'd say almost everything will work in significantly older versions of Gradle. Okay, so moving on. Yeah, ask questions whatever you like. I'm glancing at the questions here. Again, I don't see anything I fundamentally see there. Yeah, yeah, okay, so let's see, user local bin. Oh, I don't think I have installed it. Yeah, see, I didn't actually do it. Guess it couldn't hurt. Brew install Gradle. If it takes any time at all, I'll leave it and I'll come back. Oh, of course, it's got to update Homebrew. I mean, I use Homebrew for lots of installations. But apparently, since I use SDK Man, I haven't used I haven't installed Gradle this way. Comment, doesn't look like there's Kotlin support for build files in VS Code or Vim. I thought there was a Vim plugin, for the Kotlin build files. That I'm not sure about. Vim, I think you're right. I don't think they understand the Kotlin DSL in Vim. I thought VS Code had it, but maybe not. I don't know. That's a good point. Is it true that Gradle is, that's another question in the Q and the questions list. Is it true that Gradle is targeted on JVM-based applications? Is it possible to use Gradle for C++? That's something I do want to address. Gradle is supposed to be a general purpose build tool. It is not necessarily for Java apps. In fact, there are plugins for a wide variety of languages. There's PyGradle, for example, for Python. There is a Pony plugin, for Ponylang. There's a whole bunch of plugins. And they do have native support. What they call native support is for C and C++ applications. That's a little beyond the scope of what we're going to have time for in our limited amount of time, but I can point you to the information on that at the Gradle website. I don't know why this is taking so long. I'm going to leave it. And there's plenty of documentation on it. I'll simply say, though, that the native support has undergone some rather significant changes relatively recently, and therefore I don't necessarily have the most up-to-date information here. But if I went on to the Gradle website, and now I make it smaller again or I lose the menu at the top, and you could go dig in and look for sections about the native support. I know there's some in the, what they call the, where is it? The Getting Started guides. So if I look in the Get Started guides, then I can click on, or I could just put it in, I think C. Yeah, see, there's building C++ applications and C++ libraries, and there's some information on that. So that's all I'm going to point out about that now, but there are many possibilities. Oh, that finally kicked in. I wonder if that was waiting. So looks like it looks like I got 6.5.1. So there was not much point. I was going to show that it was a different version under brew install, and apparently it's not. Apparently it was the same version for me at the moment. So I'm not going to address that right now. Okay. Materials. So yeah, we have objectives. Sure, let's move on. All right, now I do want to mention one thing about this set of topics that in principle we will not cover. That's not quite true. I'm going to make some modifications. Now it says we're not going to talk about Android or Scala. Well, that's true. I don't plan to talk about Scala. Android, however, I'd be happy to talk about briefly. And if we have time tomorrow, I'll go over an Android build file, because Android build files are a good example of a multi-project Gradle build. They're simple multi-project Gradle builds if you're looking at just a simple Android app. But that's not a bad thing, and it also demonstrates the use of a plugin and auto-generated builds. So if we have time, I'll show you an example of an Android build, and if you have Android-related questions, I'll be happy to address them. I don't plan to talk about continuous integration or delivery, other than to say that all the major CI and CD tools have Gradle support built into them. Jenkins, Hudson, they have Gradle plugins, both natively, that in other words, let you just say, oh, I'm creating a new job and it's a Gradle job and I want you to run the following tasks. That's fine, they all support that. And then there are other tools that, there are other plugins you could add native to that tool that will give you additional Gradle features if you want. There's some really good YouTube videos by a friend of mine, Shuman Stepniak, who talks about integration with Jenkins pipelines, for example. So when we take a break, I'll look that up and I'll give you a link to that for those people who might want it. Now, it says we won't talk about IDE integration, but everybody always wants to talk about it. So I intend to do at least one demo with IntelliJ IDEA and at least one demo with an Eclipse-based tool. I'll either use regular Eclipse or I'll use Spring Tool Suite and show how you can work with Gradle in those. It's not really that complicated, frankly, it's pretty straightforward, but it's a nice demo. So I will use that as an opportunity to talk about customizing your project layout or customizing Gradle to work with a non-standard project layout in there. So I'll talk about ID integration at least as we go along, probably tomorrow. Custom tasks, I also want to do a custom task, and I'll explain what that means later. But basically, it's writing your own class that backs a Gradle task, so that when you basically are defining a Gradle task of your own by defining the class that it delegates to. And I do like doing that because it will help you understand the life cycle a lot better. We are not going to talk about plugin development. That's true. That's a little bit beyond what we have time for, but there is material on the Gradle website about that. And then the question about advanced dependency management techniques basically comes down to what you consider to be advanced, because we do have a whole chapter on dependency management. So we will be getting to that. Okay, now this is basically a list of chapters in the material. So here's your agenda, if you will. And my plan is to get somewhere into working with the file system today. I mean, like I say, we're going to be a little slower today, but we're going to cover a lot of good stuff and talk about some things that aren't in the materials as well. And the archive stuff, so tomorrow we'll start with the file system and the archives. Those are kind of together. We'll deal with the Java plugin, dependency management. Build scans is really quick, and multi-project builds. I'm actually going to talk a little bit about that today and a little bit about tomorrow, because I want to use an example from the open source community that uses a multi-project build just to show you what they look like. It's actually remarkably simple. It's a little misleading seeing multi-project builds at the end. It kind of makes it sound like it's a difficult topic or complicated, when in fact, most of what you do with it is really simple. So we will look at that today as well. So I'm not going to keep strictly to this pattern, but those are the chapters in the materials. I'm more or less going to follow this, and I tend to add some of my own examples as we go along. Okay. Coming to on a break. So let me go a couple more minutes, and then I'll address some of the questions, and then we'll take our break. So the prereq says that you should have some ability to read or write Java or Groovy code. I think that's actually more of a bar than we need. There's a group of people who you would probably consider with a job title a build master rather than a developer. It's more of a DevOps thing, if you will. So it's got some development features to it, but it's operations as much as anything else. And those people are not necessarily Java developers. I will say that there's a lot of information in the class today and tomorrow that will work even for them. I'd say that you will get more out of it if you're at least comfortable with Java, if you're okay with Java. Now, if you decide to spend a lot of time with Gradle, to really dig into it, I would recommend coming up to speed on Groovy or potentially on Kotlin. And I will try to explain those Groovy related features as we go along, but it's not critical, and I don't expect you to have that ability before we start. In fact, one of the really nice features about Groovy is that it is extremely intuitive for Java developers. So if you have a Java background, the Groovy syntax just looks like Java, but simpler. Now, of course, Groovy is a unique language. It goes way beyond what Java can do, but I'll stick with just the major features there as we go. Basic understanding of build automation. Heck, if you've ever run a build file to say, compile my code, run all the tests, and generate an output jar file, that's plenty. If you've used Ant before, that's enough. So you don't need a lot there either. Okay, and I do want to cover the very basics. So this is going to be very quick. Let me just say what the Gradle project is about. Gradle is the open source project at gradle.org, and it is based on the JVM. It is written in Java. You do need a JDK to run it on the JRE or whatever. You have to have Java in order to execute it. And somebody said, do we need Java Home because it's implemented in Java? Do you need it? I don't know that you absolutely need it, but I do recommend it. Can you get around without it? I don't know. There have been times when you could, there have been times when you couldn't. That's one of the things that changed. But I do recommend having a Java Home variable because Gradle will be looking for it. Whether Gradle gives you an error if you don't have it, that's the thing that's changed over the years. I'm not sure whether it currently does or not. What I do recommend, however, is having a Java home variable that points to your JDK installation, wherever that is, wherever that happens to be. So, okay, it is implemented basically as a Java tool. Okay, the Gradle project is under the Apache license, version 2 license, and there's the GitHub repository. I actually can go to that if I wanted to. Oh shoot, I didn't want to do that, did I? See, I knew if I went there and went back, that should have opened in another page. That's what I'm sorry about that. Let me scroll forward to it again. Okay, let me open it in a new tab. So here is the GitHub repository, the Gradle group, and then the Gradle project underneath it. And there's a getting started information. And if you want to build anything, it's all here, and where you get help, etc. So you can dig into the source code if you want. You can look at current issues. You can look at various branches if you like. There's a whole bunch of them out there. You know, we're not really going to need that, but it's available if you want. Now this discuss.gradle.org, that is useful. That is the Gradle forum at discuss.gradle.org. And you can browse this without actually logging in. But if you want to ask a question, you would log in. So this is a good place to go. Of course, there are questions tagged with Gradle and Stack Overflow as well. There's no downside to looking at Stack Overflow. But the Gradle team, I know, tends to keep track of what's going on in this set of forums. Okay, so I do recommend that if you have a lot of questions, this is a really good place to go, especially if you want to do something like say, oh, I want to use this plugin, what's the experience with it, or just browsing and seeing if there's information about it or special cases. This is a mature enough project that it's unlikely you'll come up with a question that nobody's ever seen before. You know what I mean? It's been around a while, and while of course there'll be things that are custom to your environment, but generally, most questions that are the sorts of questions you run into in the first couple of weeks of using Gradle are addressed somewhere. And it's nice to be able to browse them in here. So that's a good place too. If you ask me a really hard question I can't answer, that's where I'm gonna go. Now, Gradle, for the past like 3 or 4 years, has been on a very rapid release schedule. They released it roughly, it's more like 6 to 8 weeks. And that's why the version numbers have climbed so high. But I got to tell you that most of the changes have been functionality under the hood. And if you used Gradle in version 2 or above, most everything we do is going to look familiar or may work directly as you see it. So don't worry about having an older version, but I do want to show you the latest stuff so we can address that. Okay, and then we're going to go to the user guide and the DSL reference and the various Gradle guides. And that's where I think this page, this section ends. We will talk about the Gradle distribution after the break and this book section. So what I mean is over here, this again is Gradle.org. There's a section called docs. I'll go to it. Well, I'll go and I'll come back. So the docs section opens up the Gradle user manual. And also on the side here, there's a link to some samples, and the Gradle API is where you get the DSL reference, both in Groovy and in Kotlin. So we will look through here, although I got to tell you, while they do have a table of contents, I find this search box more helpful than everything else. I tend to just search inside there. Now, the other issues that I'll mention right before we take our break is if you look under the About section, you see there's a discussion of Gradle and Kotlin, of Maven versus Gradle, and more features, more resources rather. And if I go under more resources, you see there's the link to the newsletter, there's a link to the blog, there's the Gradle Twitter feed as well. And there's that link about books about Gradle, one of which is free, the rest are not, but this one called Gradle Recipes for Android, that one is a free download, although it's free in the sense that you have to give them an email address. So they still want your information, but other than that, that's free. That's the one I wrote. So I can answer questions about that, if you're interested. So there's a bunch of resources that you can use for information. Okay, I don't see any questions in the Q&A widget that I need to address before we take our break. So let me go to my break timer here, and I'm going to change that to, 10 minutes. And here's my plan. I'm going to start the timer. I'm going to mute my mic. I will leave the screen share on, and that way you'll see how much time we have left before we resume. But I will be around, and during the break, I will be trying to answer as many of the questions in the Q&A widget that I can. Okay, so I will see you all in about 10 minutes. Let me get that full screen. Okay, take care. Hey, welcome back. I still have several questions that I didn't quite get to in the question list, but I did answer a bunch of them. If I didn't get to your questions, then we should be, please feel free to ask them again. One question that did come up from a couple people, however, is that issue of Gradle versus Maven, the whole build tool space. And I don't want to take a lot of time on that, but I'll take 2 minutes. Under the About section on the homepage here, see that, I'm sorry, there's a link called Maven versus Gradle. And I will tell you, here's the TLDR answer. Okay, the too long didn't read answer. Gradle is between 10 and 100 times faster than Maven on small, medium, and large projects. And this page has the data to back that up. They'll show it. They'll show everything. Okay, so it really is. If performance is your primary consideration, then Gradle wins hands down. Isn't even close. Gradle, however, the issue with Gradle, if there is one, is user experience. Now down here they talk about user experience, but I have to admit that if your build tool uses an XML file, obviously code assist based on an XML schema is going to be really good, no matter what tool you're using, what IDE you're using. Whereas Gradle's build is based on a DSL and even allows you to run, Groovy code or Kotlin code of any kind. And therefore the IDE support is a lot harder to manage. Gradle is sometimes too flexible. There are sometimes too many ways to do something, and therefore it can be quite confusing. I hope to clear up some of that during class today and tomorrow. I really hope to address that issue. I have seen some people go back to Maven. Most people who go back to Maven are doing it because Maven gives them few choices. You have to do things the way Maven wants you to do them. It's what we call a highly opinionated project. But if you do things the way it wants you to do them, it does them very well. The issue with Maven is always how hard it is to customize. I mean, you wind up having to write your own Maven plugins on a regular basis. Now, if you are good at that, then you can make Maven do anything. But otherwise, it's very painful. Whereas Gradle is inherently flexible. Gradle, by its very definition, assumes that every build will be a custom build of some kind. But again, then the downside is hey, every build can be a custom build, so it can be harder to know what to do. So if your primary goal is speed, performance, then Gradle wins without doubt. If your concern is complexity or understanding what's going on, well, Maven has been pretty stable for an awfully long time, and Gradle's basically stable, but there is a lot of flexibility. So those are more or less the